I'm confiscating this package.
You really shouldn't touch that.
The confrontation on Whispering Pines Lane did not begin with a shout, but with the high-pitched rhythmic squeak of a green plastic utility wagon. It was a sound that the residents of Oakwood Estates had learned to associate with impending financial misfortune. The wagon dragged behind Helen Voss like a small green shadow of administrative doom was currently parked at the precise intersection of Elm Court and the damp asphalt of the public road. Inside it, resting atop a confiscated plastic pink flamingo and a rogue non-compliant bag of black mulch, was a flat cardboard envelope with a distinctive red and blue border. Julian Cole stood on the curb, his long shadow stretching across the manicured Kentucky bluegrass that was by decree of the Oakwood Homeowners Association Covenant 4B, exactly 2.5 inches tall. Behind him stood Emily, his wife, her knuckles white, as she clutched a folder of academic correspondence from the Max Planck Institute in Munich. The flight to Frankfurt was scheduled to depart from Chicago O'Hare in exactly 36 hours. The paper envelope in the wagon contained her passport, her visa, her 10-year academic dream. Oakwood Estates was not merely a residential subdivision. It was a socio-aesthetic experiment in aggressive monotony, a master-planned community designed to strip away the chaotic, beautiful irregularities of human existence and replace them with the sterile, predictable comforting of an assembly line. Here, under the heavy, humid sky of Midwestern autumn, where the mist clung to the roofs of the identical houses, like a damp shroud, the lawns did not grow. They conformed. Every blade of Kentucky bluegrass was legally mandated by Section 4, Paragraph B of the association's bylaws to stand between exactly 2.5 and 3 inches in height. This was not a guideline. It was a sacred covenant, a mathematical limit, policed by a rotating patrol of retired men with digital calipers, clipboards, and too much time on their hands. These men, deputized by their own profound boredom and armed with the power to ruin their neighbors' credit scores, spent their mornings wandering the damp cul-de-sacs, like low-level guards in an outdoor asylum. They would bend down their knees, cracking in the chilly morning air, to measure a stray dandelion or a patch of clover with the analytical intensity of diamond cutters. A fraction of an inch too tall and a yellow violation notice would be taped to the resident's front door before lunch. The houses themselves, clad in identical non-reflective shades of desert sand, autumn mist, or harvest bone, stood like polite brainwashed soldiers in a perpetual silent parade of absolute conformity. To paint a front door crimson or teal was considered an act of overt civil disobedience, a dangerous strike against property values that would immediately summon an emergency board meeting. To allow a single dandelion to go to seed and release its wispy, uncontrollable white parasols into the air was treated as an act of treason, an ecological assault on the collective illusion of control. It was a manicured panopticon, a paradise for the pathologically petty, and a slow, suffocating purgatory for anyone who still possessed a shred of independent spirit. It was the American dream package, plastic-wrapped and policed by a committee of retirees who had turned the maintenance of property values into a cult of personality. At the absolute apex of this manicured panopticon sat Helen Voss, the Grand Inquisitor of Oakwood Estates. She was a woman whose entire psychological existence had been structured around the pursuit, documentation, and penalization of minor infractions, having found in the HOA a perfect consequence-free outlet for her pathological need to control others. As the vice president of the association and the self-appointed chairwoman of the Aesthetic Harmony Committee, Helen did not merely live in the neighborhood. She ruled it. She patrolled the pristine asphalt loops in a slow-rolling, low-emission beige Lexus, her speed never exceeding the strictly enforced neighborhood limit of 12 miles per hour. Her eyes constantly scanning the horizons for rogue garden hoses, left uncoiled, non-compliant bird feeders that might attract unauthorized wildlife, or trash cans left on the curb for even a single minute past the 600 p.m. curfew. She did not walk like a civilian. She marched with the stiff military gait of a drill sergeant dragging behind her, the little green plastic utility wagon with squeaking, unoiled wheels. A wagon that had become a symbol of terror in the neighborhood used to collect evidence of suburban decay. Under her reign, the neighborhood had slowly morphed into a silent, sterile landscape, a quiet graveyard of human expression, where children did not play outside for fear of violating the association's noise decibel limitations, and neighbors did not speak to one another over the fences for fear of being reported for displaying non-compliant patio cushions or planting unauthorized geraniums. She had turned the neighborhood into an administrative machine where every resident was both a prisoner and a potential informant. When Julian spoke, his voice was low, carrying the flat, dangerous weight of a systems engineer who dealt in absolute binary logic. He did not yell. He simply stated a fact. "You have our mail, Helen." Helen Voss turned slowly. Her eyes, small and sharp behind designer tortoiseshell sunglasses, crinkled at the corners in a sugary, artificial smile. She adjusted her clipboard, her fingers resting lightly on a stack of yellow warning slips. Her face hardened by years of sunbathing by the community pool and policed by her own unyielding sense of righteousness was a mask of practiced condescending serenity. In her mind, she was not an annoying neighbor. She was a magistrate, a sentinel of order in a world threatened by the chaos of unraked leaves and unapproved packages. "Oh, Julian, Emily." Helen's voice was a practiced, dramatic soprano carrying across the quiet autumn air. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? Though I must say, Julian, I noticed some oil stains on your driveway near the garage door. A Class C violation. You really should power wash that before the board meeting on Tuesday. It's details like that which preserve our property values, you know." "The envelope, Helen," Julian said, his eyes locked on the wagon. "The Priority Mail Express package. It was delivered to our porch 10 minutes ago. It belongs to us." Helen sighed, a long theatrical exhalation of disappointment, the sort of sigh a weary school teacher might reserve for a particularly slow child. She reached into the wagon and picked up the envelope. Julian's eyes instantly caught the clean sliced edge of the cardboard packaging. The adhesive seal had been neatly slit open. The private sovereign correspondence of two citizens had been violated with the casual indifference of a postal clerk sorting junk mail. "Ah, you mean this," Helen said, holding it just out of physical reach. "Well, yes, I had to secure it. It was left unattended on your front steps, Julian. Under Amendment 42 of the Oakwood Estates Code of Harmony, no unapproved packages may remain on the front porch or entryway for more than 5 minutes without being considered an aesthetic hazard and an open invitation to neighborhood theft. As the vice president of the association, it is my sworn duty to protect this community from the slipshod habits of its residents." "An aesthetic hazard," Julian repeated, his jaw tightening. "It is a Federal Express mail package containing official government documents, and you opened it." "I did no such thing," Helen gasped, placing her hand over her chest in an elaborate display of wounded innocence, though she made no effort to conceal the sliced edge. "I merely inspected the exterior to determine which household it belonged to, as the delivery driver had carelessly left it exposed to the elements. As the vice president of the association, it is my duty to secure these items. However, since it had been left unattended for a total of 8 minutes, I timed it, Julian. I was parked just down the street. It has been processed as an impounded aesthetic violation. You cannot expect us to allow the neighborhood to look like a warehouse loading dock." Emily took a step forward, her voice cracking with a desperation that she could not hide. "Helen, please, my flight is tomorrow night. If I don't have that visa, my fellowship is gone. The Max Planck Institute won't hold the position. Please just give it to us." Helen's eyes narrowed behind her sunglasses. The artificial warmth vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze of a bureaucrat who had finally cornered her prey. She saw their desperation not as a human tragedy, but as a lever of administrative power. "Well, Emily, I sympathize, I truly do," Helen said, her voice dropping into a flat, hard tone. "But the rules are the rules. We cannot make exceptions or the whole system breaks down. The impoundment fee for a Class A porch violation is $150. And since your account currently has 3 outstanding aesthetic warnings from last month, including that highly inappropriate compost bin you tried to hide behind your azaleas, there is an administrative clearance penalty. To release this item immediately, you will need to pay a total of $500 in cash or by cashier's check made out to the association. It's standard procedure." $500, Julian said. He took a half-step closer, his broad athletic frame casting a long dark shadow over Helen's visor. "You are holding federal mail hostage for an HOA fine. Do you have any idea what you are doing?" "I am protecting this community," Helen said, her voice rising to meet his sharp and venomous. "And I am enforcing the covenants that you signed when you bought that house. If you don't like the rules, Julian, you shouldn't have moved to Oakwood Estates. Now, if you want your little envelope, you can bring the $500 in cash to the community office during my office hours on Monday morning." I'll be there between 9 and 11. Monday, Emily cried, her tears finally spilling over. My flight is Saturday. Helen, please, you can't do this. You're going to ruin my life. Monday, Emily. Helen repeated, her smile returning like a cold blade. Unless, of course, you'd like to pay the expedited processing fee of $750. But either way, I don't accept personal checks from non-compliant residents. Have a wonderful day. With that, Helen turned on her heel, the wheels of her little green wagon squeaking loudly as she pulled it toward her idling Lexus. She tossed the envelope back into the plastic tub right next to the stolen yard flamingo and slammed the trunk. The sound of the heavy metal lid latching was like a gunshot in the quiet, humid morning air. Julian stood on the damp curb, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his dark coat, watching the beige Lexus slowly roll down the street, its tires throwing up a fine spray of muddy water onto his grass. Beside him, Emily was trembling, her quiet tears spilling onto the gravel driveway, reflecting the gray, indifferent light of the autumn sky. The ticking of the clock had begun its mechanical pulse, echoing in his mind with the cold, unyielding rhythm of a countdown timer. The rules of the neighborhood rules that they had laughed at as a minor annoyance when they first signed the deed had suddenly mutated into a hostile system, a wall designed to trap them and strip them of their future. Julian did not feel anger. Anger was an unstable, inefficient emotion that clouded judgment and led to logical errors. Instead, he felt a sudden, profound, and icy clarity. He was a systems engineer. He spent his life analyzing structures, finding vulnerabilities, and designing patches to correct systemic bugs. And Helen Voss, despite her clipboard, her Lexus, and her absolute belief in her own administrative sovereignty, was nothing more than a bug in the code. She was a predictable, arrogant piece of bad data that had managed to hijack the local operating system. And like any bug, she could be patched. He just had to find her single critical point of failure and let the system run its course to its logical, inevitable conclusion. The silence in the coal kitchen that afternoon was thick and suffocating, interrupted only by the steady metallic ticking of the wall clock. The light that filtered through the double-pane glass was gray and flat, matching the mood of the room. On the oak table sat the cardboard envelope, its edges slightly damp from the autumn mist, the sliced seam gaping open like an accusation. They had paid. There had been no other choice. Emily had stood in the driveway, her face pale under the autumn sun, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold her phone to verify her bank balance. The sheer irrational terror of losing her postdoctoral fellowship, the hard-won culmination of 10 years of endless late-night lab work, of writing countless grant proposals, of sacrificing her youth, her weekends, and her personal life for the sake of molecular science, had completely paralyzed her. She was a brilliant scientist, a woman who could map the complex interactions of cellular proteins, yet she was utterly defenseless against the petty legalistic extortion of a neighborhood board member. Julian had driven to the drive-through ATM at the local branch of First Merchants Bank, his chest tight with a cold, simmering fury that seemed to restrict his breathing. The ATM was located in a sterile concrete strip mall on the edge of town, a place of commercial transaction where human value was reduced to account balances. He had inserted his green debit card into the cold plastic slot, entered his PIN with hard, deliberate strokes, and withdrawn 5 crisp $100 bills from their modest savings account. The machine had dispensed the cash with a cheerful mechanical hum, a series of rapid, high-pitched clicks that sounded like a miniature printing press, entirely indifferent to the fact that it was participating in the legal heist of a young couple's hard-earned money. Julian stared at the bills in his hand, crisp green portraits of Benjamin Franklin, now being used to bribe a suburban tyrant for the return of a stolen passport. The irony was bitter, and it burned. He remembered the look on Helen's face when he handed over the money on the porch of her pristine beige brick home. The house was a temple of suburban excess, with manicured boxwood shrubs lining the walkway and a seasonal wreath of dried pine cones hanging perfectly centered on the front door. Helen had counted the bills slowly, her fingers moist and stubby, her eyes glittering with the satisfaction of a petty feudal lord collecting taxes from a peasant. She hadn't even offered a receipt, merely tossing the envelope onto her glass patio table and saying, "Let this be a lesson, Julian. The board always wins. We are the ones who keep this neighborhood from turning into a slum." Emily had spent the next 3 hours in a state of quiet hysteria, checking her passport pages for any damage, verifying the visa stamp, and packing her remaining bags with the frantic, disjointed energy of someone escaping a war zone. She was terrified that Helen would find some other rule, some other amendment to block her departure. Julian had driven her to O'Hare that evening 30 hours early just to ensure she was safely beyond the reach of Oakwood Estates and its self-appointed warden. "Don't come back until this is sorted," she had whispered to him at the International Terminal departure gate, her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, her fingers clutching his coat as if she were letting go of her only anchor. "Julian, she's crazy. She's completely obsessed. She's going to find a way to take the house. She's done it to others." "She won't take the house," Julian had replied, kissing her forehead, his voice calm, steady, and devoid of the fury that was burning behind his ribs. "Go to Munich. Focus on your research. I'll handle Helen, I promise." But handling Helen proved to be an exercise in psychological warfare. When Julian returned to the empty house on Whispering Pines Lane late that night, the headlights of his car swept across the front door. There, taped perfectly at eye level, was a bright yellow slip of paper. "Violation notice. Unapproved vehicle occupancy of driveway past 10 p.m. visitor parking rules. Penalty $100. It was his own car. I had parked it in his own driveway after returning from the airport at midnight. The absurdity of it was almost comical, but Julian knew it wasn't a joke. It was a declaration of war. By Tuesday morning, the front door was adorned with 3 more slips. Helen had clearly been busy over the weekend patrolling his property like a surveyor mapping a conquered territory. Violation notice. Failure to maintain uniform turf density at sidewalk boundary. Penalty $200. Violation notice. Display of non-compliant window dressings visible from common areas. Penalty $300. Violation notice. Exceeding permissible decibel limits for residential zones during quiet hours. Penalty $500. The decibel limit violation was accompanied by a handwritten note in Helen's neat looping cursive. Mechanical clicking sounds audible from the sidewalk between 11:00 p.m. and 2:00 a.m. Keyboard usage must be conducted with closed windows and sound-dampening curtains. We must maintain our peaceful sanctuary. Julian sat at his kitchen table staring at the yellow slips. They were absurd, of course. No court of law would ever enforce a fine for typing with an open window or for having grass that was slightly thinner near the concrete path. But HOAs did not operate in courts of law. They operated in the twilight zone of property liens and administrative foreclosures. If these fines remained unpaid, the HOA had the legal right under Indiana state law to file a lien against his property, a quiet, deadly process that could eventually allow them to force a sale of the house to satisfy the debt. It was a slow-motion heist protected by a veneer of civil contract law. He decided to seek help from the traditional authorities. At 2:00 p.m. on Wednesday, Julian sat in the cramped, fluorescent-lit lobby of the Porter County Sheriff's Department waiting for someone to acknowledge his existence. The lobby was a monument to administrative depression. The air, heavy and stagnant, smelled of stale coffee that had been burnt on the burner since Monday industrial-grade pine floor cleaner, and the damp, slightly sour smell of wet wool coats from the people who had come to pay traffic fines or report minor thefts. A buzzing fluorescent tube overhead flickered at a frequency that gave Julian a dull headache, casting a yellow, sickly light over the rows of hard plastic chairs. Behind the thick, scratched sheet of bulletproof glass sat Officer Higgins, a beefy, middle-aged man with a thick gray mustache, a deeply lined face, and a faded polyester uniform that looked at least one size too small, his belly spilling over a heavy leather duty belt that sagged under the collective weight of his service weapon, heavy handcuffs, an expandable baton, and a radio that crackled occasionally with the static of local police dispatch. Higgins was typing slowly on an ancient terminal using only his 2 index fingers, his expression one of pure, unadulterated bureaucratic apathy. "Let me get this straight," Higgins said, leaning back in his creaking chair, the leather groaning under his weight as he looked at the stack of yellow violation notices Julian had slid through the slot. "Your HOA is fining you for grass and typing." "Yes," Julian said, his voice quiet, almost flat. "But more importantly, last week, the vice president of the HOA, Helen Voss, intercepted a Federal Express mail package containing my wife's passport. She held it hostage until I paid her $500 in cash. I have the bank withdrawal receipt, and I have camera footage of her carrying the package away from my property. That's mail theft and extortion." Higgins sighed, rubbing his temples, a slow, heavy gesture of professional exhaustion. He didn't look at the footage Julian held out on his phone. Look, kid, Higgins said, his voice flat with the apathy of a man who had spent 20 years dealing with neighbor disputes, loud dogs, and property line arguments. This is a civil matter. You bought a house in an HOA. You signed the covenant's conditions and restrictions, the CC&Rs. That means you agreed to their arbitration process and their fee structure. If they say you owe $500 for a porch violation, then as far as we're concerned, that's a contract dispute. We don't get involved in contracts. She took my mail, Julian said, his voice quiet but steady. She ripped the envelope. She demanded cash on the street to give it back. That's extortion, officer. That's mail theft. Mail theft is when a guy in a hoodie steals Amazon boxes off your steps to sell them on eBay. Higgins replied, waving his hand dismissively. This is just a neighborhood spat. Your lady boss was securing the property according to her interpretation of the bylaws. We don't get involved in HOA politics. It's a massive headache for the department. Go to the next board meeting, talk to a real estate lawyer, or pay the fines. My advice, just mow your grass and keep your windows shut when you're typing. It's cheaper than a lawyer. And the $500, consider it an expensive lesson in reading the fine print before you sign a deed, Higgins said, sliding the yellow slips back through the glass with a thick, calloused finger. Have a nice day, Mr. Cole. Julian stood up slowly, folding the yellow papers and slipping them into his jacket pocket. He looked at Officer Higgins, then at the faded American flag standing in the corner of the lobby. The system of local authority was designed to maintain order, not justice. It was a machine that ran on the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance always favored the established bully. Julian unlocked his car with a quiet mechanical beep, sat in the cold leather driver's seat, and watched the windshield wipers sweep the heavy autumn rain away in rhythmic, screeching sweeps. The glass was blurred with water, distorting the pristine beige brick facades of the neighborhood into watery, melting shapes. He pulled out his sleek silver laptop from his leather messenger bag, rested it on his knees connected to his phone's cellular hotspot, and began to search the digital archives. He did not search for local property laws, county zoning ordinances, or expensive HOA defense attorneys who would charge him $500 an hour to write polite, useless letters of protest. He did not waste his time with the local courts or state-level administrative boards. He went straight to the top of the food chain. He opened the digital database of the federal government and searched the United States Code, the codification of the permanent laws of the United States. Specifically, he scrolled down to Title 18, Part 1, Chapter 83, Postal Service. He read the statutes slowly, his eyes reflecting the white glare of the screen, his mind mapping the jurisdictional boundaries of the land. He saw how the federal government had carved out a sacred, untouchable space within every home in the nation, a sovereign boundary that began at the lip of the mailbox and ended at the seal of the envelope. I saw how this boundary was protected not by local sheriff's deputies or municipal judges, but by a select group of federal agents who had spent 2 centuries protecting the nation's mail. He smiled, a cold, calculated expression of mathematical certainty. Helen Voss believed she was the law in Oakwood Estates. She was about to find out that she was nothing more than an unauthorized trespasser on the sovereign territory of the United States of America. There is a distinct brand of madness that thrives in the American suburbs, a psychological rot that occurs when individuals with no actual power are given a tiny shred of administrative authority. Helen Voss was the perfect manifestation of this disease. In her mind, the borders of Oakwood Estates marked the end of the civilized world and the beginning of her absolute domain. She did not see herself as a volunteer board member. She saw herself as a magistrate, a sentinel of order in a world constantly threatened by the chaos of unraked leaves. On Friday morning, Helen decided to raise the stakes. Julian had gone to the local hardware store to buy some power washing detergent, a quiet concession to her demands, or so she would think. I had spent an hour walking the aisles of the local independent hardware shop, looking at real tools, smelling the clean scent of oil and fertilizer, and talking to men who actually worked with their hands. It was a sharp, refreshing contrast to the artificial world of Oakwood Estates, where the only tools used were digital calipers and clipboards. When he returned, he found the neighborhood mail carrier's truck parked at the end of the cul-de-sac. The carrier, a young woman named Sarah, who always looked exhausted, was stuffing envelopes into the community cluster mailbox that stood on a concrete pad at the corner of Whispering Pines Lane. Julian walked down to retrieve his mail. As he approached, he saw Helen Voss standing near the cluster box, her clipboard held tight against her chest like a breastplate. She was talking to Sarah, her voice sharp and commanding, her posture rigid. "As I told you, Sarah," Helen was saying, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp air, The association has placed an administrative hold on the mail for Lot 14. We have the legal authority under our updated bylaws to intercept and hold delivery for non-compliant residents who are in active default of their assessments. It's a standard legal procedure to protect our financial integrity. Sarah looked profoundly uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one foot to the other on the damp concrete pad, her heavy dark blue leather mailbag sagging from her shoulder and pulling her uniform shirt tight. She had been delivering mail in this county for 5 years, dealing with barking dogs, icy steps, and blistering summer heat, but nothing in her training manual had prepared her for the aggressive, relentless interference of Helen Voss. "Ma'am, I really can't just hand you their mail," Sarah said, her voice dropping as she glanced around the quiet street, hoping a delivery van or a passerby would provide a distraction. "I have to put it directly in their assigned box. That's the federal regulation, ma'am. It's a violation of USPS policy to hand a resident's mail to a third party without an authorized delivery order on file. I can get suspended or even fired for this, and I need this job." "I am not asking you to give it to me," Helen said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I am instructing you to leave it in the association's secure holding box at the community clubhouse. Or alternatively, I will take it now and sign for it as the authorized representative of the property. Julian Cole is in active violation of municipal and association codes, and we are exercising our right of administrative lien." "Helen," Julian said, stepping onto the concrete pad. Sarah looked visibly relieved at his arrival, stepping back slightly to create distance between herself and the vice president of the HOA. "Mr. Cole, morning. I have some mail for you." "Do not hand him those items, Sarah." Helen snapped, her face flushing red beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Julian, your account is currently delinquent by $3,200. Until that debt is settled in full, the board has voted to suspend your access to all community utilities and common services, including the postal distribution pad. Your mail will be held at the clubhouse as security." Julian ignored Helen entirely. He stepped up to the cluster box, held out his hand to Sarah, and said, "I'll take my mail, please." Sarah quickly slid 3 envelopes into Julian's hand. One was a thick official envelope from the Internal Revenue Service containing his quarterly federal tax documents. The other 2 were certified bank statements. Helen's hand shot out, her long acrylic nails clawing at the paper. She managed to grab the corner of the IRS envelope, pulling it back. "This is association property now," Helen yelled, her voice losing all its sugar, degenerating into a harsh, hysterical shriek. "You don't get to ignore us, Julian. You don't get to break the rules and still enjoy the privileges of this neighborhood." Julian did not pull back. He simply held his grip on the other end of the envelope, his fingers steady, his eyes locking onto Helen's. "Helen," Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was far more terrifying than her scream. "Let go of the envelope." "No," she screamed. "I am the vice president of this board. I represent the law here." With a sharp jerk, Helen ripped the envelope from Julian's hand. The paper tore slightly along the seam, exposing the white IRS documents inside. She turned and stuffed it into her green plastic wagon, covering it with her clipboard. "You'll get this back when I see a cashier's check for $3,200 on my desk," she said, her chest heaving as she glared at him. "And don't bother calling the sheriff. They already told you it's a civil matter." Sarah, the mail carrier, stood frozen, her eyes wide with horror, her hand resting on the metal door of the cluster box. "Ma'am, you can't do that. That's the mail. That's a federal offense." "Mind your own business, Sarah, and finish your route," Helen hissed, turning her back on them and marching toward her Lexus. Julian did not chase her. He did not raise his voice. He stood on the concrete pad, watching her place the torn IRS envelope into the trunk of her car. He looked down at his hand, then at Sarah. "Are you okay, Sarah?" Julian asked gently. She just took your federal tax mail," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. I have to report this to my supervisor. I can't let people just snatch mail out of my hand or the boxes." "Yes," Julian said, a cold, brilliant smile spreading across his face. "Yes, you do, and so do I." Julian walked back to the house, his mind operating with the cool, calculated efficiency of a computer running a terminal script. Julian was by training and by temperament an engineer of complex software environments. He spent his days staring at terminal screens, tracing the silent flow of data through vast, multi-layered networks, looking for the tiny microscopic errors that could cause an entire system to grind to a halt. To a civilian, a software crash seemed like a sudden chaotic event, an act of God, or a stroke of bad luck. But to Julian, there was no such thing as luck or chaos in a system. Every crash was the result of a logical sequence of events, a series of inputs and conditions that had been met in a specific order, leading to an inevitable mathematical failure. He brought this exact same analytical perspective to his interaction with the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. While other residents reacted to Helen's fines with anger tears and emotional outbursts, Julian viewed her entire organization as a poorly written, highly insecure piece of software. The bylaws were the code, the retired men with the digital calipers were the subroutines, and Helen Voss was the buggy process that had managed to escape its sandbox and consume all of the system's memory. He did not want to argue with the process. He wanted to shut it down permanently by introducing a set of inputs that the code was fundamentally unequipped to handle. And the United States Postal Service was the ultimate unyielding compiler that would execute her downfall. He did not feel anger anymore. He felt a deep, profound sense of mathematical satisfaction. Helen Voss had just stepped off the civil playing field and stepped directly into the path of the federal locomotive. Inside his study, Julian sat down and began to write. He didn't write an angry email to the HOA board. He didn't write a letter to the editor of the local paper. He opened his browser and navigated to the official portal of the United States Postal Inspection Service, the USPIS. Many Americans do not realize that the United States Postal Inspection Service is not merely an administrative department of the post office. It is, in fact, one of the oldest, most powerful, and most relentless federal law enforcement agencies in the nation, founded by Benjamin Franklin himself in 1772 to protect the sovereign flow of information in a young republic. Its inspectors are fully armed, highly trained federal agents possessing the exact same legal authority as FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, or Secret Service operatives. They have the power to execute federal arrest warrants, search houses, seize assets, and prosecute crimes under the full unyielding authority of the federal government. They do not deal in civil disputes, they do not care about neighborhood politics, and they do not give a single damn about HOA covenants, aesthetic harmony committees, or driveway oil stains. In their eyes, there is no difference between a street gang robbing a mail truck and a middle-aged woman in a beige visor stealing a package from a porch. They care about exactly one thing: the absolute untouchable sanctity of the United States. Mail, a constitutional right that was established before the state of Indiana even existed. Julian began to compile his report. First, he uploaded the high-definition footage from his newly installed smart doorbell. The camera had captured the entire interaction from the week before the blue USPS truck delivering the passport envelope, Helen Voss walking onto his porch, picking up the envelope and walking away. Second, he uploaded the digital receipt of the $500 cash withdrawal from First Merchants Bank, accompanied by a detailed chronological affidavit describing Helen's demand for cash to release his wife's passport. Third, he drafted a meticulous statement detailing the events of that morning, the physical seizure of his IRS correspondence, the tearing of the envelope, and her explicit statement that she was holding his mail hostage for a civil debt. Finally, he cited the law. Title 18, United States Code Section 1708. Whoever steals, takes, or abstracts, or by fraud or deception obtains or attempts so to obtain from or out of any mail post office or station thereof, letterbox mail receptacle, or any mail route, or other authorized depository for mail matter, or from a letter or mail carrier, any letter, postal card, package bag, or mail, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 5 years, or both. Julian clicked Submit. The trap was set, its invisible gears aligned with mathematical precision. Helen Voss had spent the last 8 years of her life painstakingly building her little wall of rules and regulations around Oakwood Estates, believing that her administrative authority and her clipboard would keep the messy, uncontrollable reality of the world out. She had spent her life cultivating an absolute illusion of power, convinced that she could use her bylaws to bully her neighbors and steal their mail with impunity, protected by the apathy of local police and the financial exhaustion of her victims. She had no idea that she had just locked herself in a small, inescapable room with the full, unyielding weight of the federal government. She was a minor bureaucrat who had mistaken her neighborhood for an empire, and she was about to discover that the borders of her kingdom ended exactly where the authority of the United States Postal Service began. Julian closed his laptop, the soft click of the lids sounding like the snapping shut of a steel jaw, and sat back in the darkening study, watching the rain beat against the glass with a steady, peaceful rhythm. Suburban tyrants are accustomed to a specific rhythm of resistance. They expect anger, they expect tears, they expect expensive, slow-moving lawyers who send polite letters on watermarked bond paper. They are prepared for all of these things because they understand the language of civil friction. They know how to drag a dispute out for months, burying their victims in administrative fees until the cost of fighting exceeds the cost of surrender. What they are not prepared for is the silent heavy weight of a federal investigation. On Monday morning, 4 days after Helen had seized his IRS mail, Julian's phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar area code and a number that ended in 4 identical digits. Julian answered. Julian Cole. Mr. Cole, a voice said. It was a dry, gravelly baritone, devoid of any inflection or emotional warmth. It was the voice of a man who spent his life reading financial ledgers and executing search warrants. This is Postal Inspector Vance, United States Postal Inspection Service. I'm calling regarding the mail theft complaint you filed on Friday. Thank you for calling back, Inspector, Julian said. I've reviewed the materials you submitted, Mr. Cole, Vance said. The video footage from your doorbell camera is exceptionally clear. The bank records and your affidavit are comprehensive. Additionally, we received a report from the local USPS route carrier, Sarah Jenkins, confirming that she witnessed an individual physically seize mail from your hand at the Whispering Pines cluster box. The individual is Helen Voss, Julian said. She's the vice president of the local homeowners association. Yes, Vance replied, and for a brief second, Julian thought he heard a faint, dry chuckle on the other end of the line. We are familiar with the Oakwood Estates HOA. They've sent several letters to our regional office over the last 2 years, attempting to register their clubhouse as an authorized mail depository so they could screen resident correspondence. We denied their requests, of course. It seems Ms. Voss decided to implement the policy regardless. She seems to believe she is operating in a jurisdictional vacuum. She's currently holding my federal tax documents and bank statements in her possession, Julian said. She's demanding $3,200 to release them. Mr. Cole, let me be very clear. Vance's voice grew even colder, taking on the heavy, unyielding tone of a judicial decree. An HOA has no more legal right to intercept, hold, or open United States mail than a street mugger has to steal your wallet. In the eyes of the federal government, Ms. Voss is not an administrator. She is a suspect in a multi-count federal felony investigation. The Postmaster General takes these matters extremely seriously. What's the next step? Julian asked. The next step is that we establish absolute proof of intent, Vance said. I can't arrest someone based solely on a neighbor dispute video if their defense attorney can claim it was a misunderstanding or a temporary holding for safekeeping. We need to catch her in a controlled, undeniable act of mail theft. Are you willing to assist us in a bait operation, Mr. Cole? Tell me what to do, Julian said. 2 hours later, Julian met Inspector Vance in the parking lot of an abandoned empty Big Lots store located 3 miles outside the borders of Oakwood Estates, right at the edge of the county line. The parking lot was a vast, depressing expanse of cracked, sun-bleached asphalt with stubborn yellow weeds and wild chicory pushing through the wide fissures and rusty, leaning light poles, standing like silent, forgotten sentinels of a long-dead retail boom. The decaying, water-stained facade of the empty building, with its faded sign outline and boarded-up glass doors, was a stark, almost violent contrast to the artificial manicured perfection of Oakwood Estates, a reminder of the messy real world that Helen Voss worked so hard to keep outside her brick gates. Vance did not look like a traditional law enforcement officer. He did not wear a heavy tactical uniform, nor did he carry himself with the aggressive physical bluster of Higgins. Instead, he wore a pristine, perfectly tailored dark gray wool suit, a crisp white shirt with silver cufflinks, and a conservative dark blue silk tie. He was in his mid-40s with short, neat salt and pepper hair, a sharp jawline, and pale blue eyes that possessed a calm, analytical intensity. He looked more like a federal prosecutor or a corporate liquidator, a man who dismantled organizations with spreadsheets and court orders rather than brute force. He was a silent professional hunter of administrative white-collar criminals. He was accompanied by 2 other men in dark blue tactical vests with the words Postal Inspector printed in high-visibility yellow across the chest. Vance opened the trunk of his unmarked sedan, revealing several neat plastic cases. From one, he pulled a standard-sized cardboard box labeled USPS Priority Mail. "This is our bait," Vance said, tapping the box. "The shipping label is real. The tracking number is active. It is addressed to you, Julian Cole, at your Whispering Pines address. But the contents are unique. Vance opened the box, revealing a thick black plastic case nestled inside foam padding. Inside this case is a military-grade GPS transponder, Vance explained. It transmits a high-frequency satellite signal every 3 seconds. The moment this box is moved more than 10 feet from your porch, my team will receive an automated alert on our mobile terminals. He then pointed to a tiny, almost invisible pinhole in the cardboard seam. This is a motion-activated micro camera. It has a cellular uplink. The second the lid of this box is opened, it will begin broadcasting live high-definition video directly to our server. We'll see exactly who opens it, and we'll see their face in real time. And the powder, Julian asked, noticing a faint, greasy residue along the inner seam of the cardboard lid. Vance smiled, a small, grim stretching of his lips. Ah, the shame dust. Yes. We've coated the inner edges with an invisible, non-toxic, highly adhesive fluorescent powder. Under normal light, it is completely invisible. You can't see it, you can't smell it, and you can't feel it. But it sticks to human skin like industrial glue. If Ms. Voss opens this box, her hands will be coated in a substance that will glow a brilliant neon green under an ultraviolet lamp. It doesn't wash off with soap water or alcohol. It takes about 4 days to wear off. It is our chemical signature of guilt. When do we start? Julian asked. Thursday morning, Vance said. We've coordinated with your regular mail carrier. She'll deliver this box along with your normal route. My team will be parked in unmarked vehicles just outside the neighborhood gates. Once the package is taken, we wait for her to open it. Once she opens it, the crime is complete. And then we execute the warrant. Julian looked down at the plain, ordinary-looking cardboard box, then up at the darkening Midwestern sky. The autumn clouds were heavy, low-hanging, and bruised with the color of lead, promising another long, freezing rain that would wash the remaining leaves from the oak trees. He felt a sudden, unexpected, and profound sense of pity for Helen Voss. She had spent her entire adult life worrying about the height of dandelions, the color of trash cans, and the exact placement of garden hoses, believing that these trivial things were the true measure of a human life. She had spent her existence constructing a fragile plastic cage of control, entirely unaware that the real unvarnished world, the world of federal agents, criminal statutes, and prison sentences, was about to break through her manicured gates with the crushing, indifferent force of a steel battering ram. She had spent her life playing a game of petty administrative tyranny, entirely unprepared for the moment the real players stepped onto the field. Julian closed the car door, the heavy thud sounding like the first note of a funeral march for her beige kingdom. The human brain is remarkably adept at normalizing tyranny. For years, the residents of Oakwood Estates had accepted Helen Voss's reign of terror because the alternative costly legal battles, constant harassment, and the social isolation of being a neighborhood pariah was simply too exhausting. They had allowed her to slowly encroach upon their lives, pixel by pixel, yard by yard, until they had forgotten what it felt like to own their own property without her permission. But Julian Cole had not forgotten. On Thursday morning at 9:45 a.m., the blue USPS mail truck turned onto Whispering Pines Lane. Julian sat in his kitchen, his laptop open on the counter, his eyes fixed on the live feed from his doorbell camera. The morning was damp and cold, a heavy mist hanging over the lawns, making the desert sand brick houses look even more uniform and sterile. Through the glass, he watched the mail carrier Sarah Jenkins walk up his steps. She carried the priority mail bait box in her hands. She placed it carefully on the welcome mat directly in the center of the camera's field of view. She paused for a moment, looking toward the corner of the street where Helen's beige Lexus was already idling, then turned and walked back to her truck. The mail truck rumbled away, its engine noise fading into the quiet autumn morning. Julian looked at his phone. A text message from Vance appeared. T1. Beacon is active. Signal strength 100%. We are in position. Julian waited. 10 minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Julian sat in his kitchen, his hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee that had gone cold, his eyes fixed on the laptop screen. The house around him was completely silent, the only sound being the low rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the street remained quiet, a sterile, empty stage where nothing happened. The mist seemed to thicken, clinging to the branches of the birch trees, and the yellow maple leaves drifted lazily through the crisp, damp air, falling onto the wet asphalt like discarded gold coins. The neighborhood looked beautiful, but it was the beauty of a museum exhibit, cold and dead. Then at exactly 9:59 a.m., the silence was broken. The familiar high-pitched, irritating squeak of the green plastic wagon echoed down the wet pavement, a sound that cut through the quiet morning like a rusty saw. Helen Voss was on her rounds. She marched with her typical military posture, her clipboard tucked under her arm, her eyes scanning the facades of the houses. When she reached the boundary of Julian's lawn, she stopped. Her gaze locked onto the white cardboard priority mailbox sitting on his welcome mat. Julian watched his monitor, holding his breath. He saw her look left then right, ensuring the street was clear. A slow, triumphant sneer spread across her face. She stepped off the sidewalk, her sneakers sinking slightly into the manicured grass. She marched up his porch steps, her green wagon squeaking behind her. Without a second's hesitation, she bent down, picked up the bait box, and tossed it into the wagon on top of a confiscated plastic gnome and some non-compliant garden tools. She didn't run. She walked with the deliberate, self-satisfied pace of an official executing a lawful seizure. She pulled her wagon back down the driveway and marched straight to her own house 3 doors down. On Julian's screen, the GPS tracker application flashed a series of red coordinates updating her location in real time on a digital map of the neighborhood. The notification read, "Subject has entered Lot 3 Voss residence. Speed 3.1 mph. Target status stationary. Operational phase T2 activated." Julian looked at the digital map. The red dot was sitting perfectly centered on Helen's dining room just 80 yards down the street. It was a strange, chilling feeling watching his neighbor's home through a satellite uplink, knowing that a team of federal agents was doing the exact same thing from an unmarked delivery van parked near the community pool, their fingers hovering over their terminals, waiting for the trap to spring. A minute later, Vance's voice crackled through Julian's laptop speaker. I had patched Julian into the live cellular uplink of the bait box's internal camera. The feed was dark for a moment. Then a sharp scraping sound echoed the sound of a silver letter opener slicing through the heavy packing tape. The cardboard lid was pulled open and sudden bright light flooded the camera lens. Helen's face appeared on the screen, filling the frame. She was sitting at her glass dining table, her tortoiseshell sunglasses pushed up onto her forehead. She looked inside the box, her brow furrowing with confusion as she saw the heavy black plastic case containing the transponder instead of the consumer goods she had likely expected. She reached her hands into the box, her fingers clawing at the edges of the plastic case to pull it out. Her palms rubbed firmly against the inner cardboard seams, pressing against the invisible fluorescent powder. "What on earth is this?" she muttered to herself, her voice crystal clear through the box's internal microphone. She lifted the heavy transponder case, her fingers slipping on the greasy residue. She rubbed her hands together, attempting to wipe the faint, oily sensation onto her beige trousers. Then, feeling a sudden itch on her forehead, she scratched her face with her right index finger, smear dusting her skin. "Is this a camera?" she whispered, leaning closer, her eyes staring directly into the pinhole lens. On the other side of the neighborhood, in an unmarked van parked near the community pool, Special Agent Vance smiled. "We have clear, undeniable visual confirmation," Vance's voice said over the encrypted radio, his tone as calm and methodical as if he were ordering a sandwich, yet carrying the heavy, chilling weight of an impending arrest. "The suspect has opened this package. The fluorescent powder has been successfully deployed. Both hands are heavily contaminated, and she has scratched her face, causing transfer of the substance to her right temple. The crime is fully completed. All units activate tracking and prepare to execute the federal arrest and search warrants. Move in quietly, gentlemen. Let's do this by the book." The transition of power in Oakwood Estates happened in a matter of seconds. At exactly 10:15 a.m., the quiet, sterile peace of Oakwood Estates was permanently shattered. 2 unmarked, mud-splattered black Ford Explorer SUVs rolled quietly past the brick and wrought iron gates of the subdivision, their tires crunching softly on the wet asphalt. They did not activate their emergency sirens, and they did not flash their lights, but their sheer heavy physical presence carried an undeniable crushing authority that made the beige Lexus parked at the curb look like a toy. They drove past Julian's house without slowing down their tinted windows, reflecting the gray autumn sky, and pulled up directly in front of Helen Voss's pristine beige brick mansion. They parked at sharp, aggressive angles, their heavy front bumpers completely blocking her driveway, and her precious beige Lexus trapping her inside her own manicured estate. Vance and 4 other postal inspectors stepped out of the vehicles. They wore their dark blue tactical vests, their badges glittering in the pale autumn sunlight. Julian walked down his driveway, standing on the sidewalk to watch. Vance marched up the brick steps of Helen's porch and knocked heavily on the door. The door. Postal inspectors opened the door. The door opened almost instantly. Helen stood in the entryway, her face contorted with anger. She had her clipboard in one hand, her other hand resting on her hip. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, her voice carrying across the quiet cul-de-sac. "Who do you think you are? This is private property. The Homeowners Association has exclusive jurisdiction over Helen Voss." Vance said, his voice flat, dry, and absolutely unyielding. "I am Special Agent Vance with the United States Postal Inspection Service. I have a warrant signed by a federal district judge for your arrest and a search warrant for these premises." "An arrest warrant?" Helen laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. "For what? Mowing the grass. This is a civil matter. I am the vice president of this board. I am enforcing the covenants. You are under arrest for the theft and extortion of United States mail under Title 18, United States Code Section 1708, Vance said. "This is ridiculous." Helen screamed, her hands waving in the air. "I haven't stolen anything. I am securing abandoned property. I have the legal right." Vance did not argue. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy black flashlight. "Ms. Voss, please hold out your hands," Vance said. "I will do no such thing." One of the tactical inspectors stepped forward gently but firmly, grasping Helen's wrists and holding her hands flat in the air. Vance clicked the switch on the black flashlight. A pale, ghostly violet light washed over Helen's hands. A collective gasp went up from the few neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalk. Under the ultraviolet light, Helen's hands were glowing. Her palms, her fingers, and the tips of her acrylic nails were bathed in a brilliant, luminous, radioactive-looking neon green luminescence. The ghostly green dust also covered her right temple, a bright streak running down her cheek where she had scratched her face. The open priority mailbox sat on the glass dining table directly behind her, its cardboard edges glowing like a neon sign under the reflected violet light. Helen stared at her hands, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The color drained from her face, leaving her leathery skin looking gray and hollow. What is this?" she whispered, her voice suddenly small and trembling. "What did you do to me?" "That is chemical evidence of mail theft, Ms. Voss," Vance said, his voice carrying no pity. "You have been caught in possession of a federal bait package. Your hands are covered in a substance that proves you opened it less than 15 minutes ago." Vance turned her around, her arms pulled behind her back. The metallic clink of the handcuffs echoed through the quiet street, a sharp, clean sound that marked the end of her reign. As two inspectors led her down the driveway toward the waiting SUV, Vance and the remaining team entered the house to execute the search warrant. 20 minutes later, they emerged carrying 3 large plastic evidence tubs. Inside the tubs were dozens of envelopes, packages, and certified letters. Some were unopened, others had been ripped open along the seams. There were tax forms, bank statements, and holiday cards containing cash, all belonging to the residents of Oakwood Estates, collected by Helen over the last 2 years and hidden in a locked metal cabinet in her basement. She had been running a private intelligence network under the guise of HOA enforcement. Julian stood on the sidewalk, his hands in his pockets, as Helen was escorted to the back seat of the Ford Explorer. Her matching beige sun visor sat crooked on her head, her sunglasses gone, her eyes wide with the realization of her new reality. She looked at Julian, her lips trembling as she tried to find some of her old administrative authority, but there was nothing left. The SUV door slammed shut, its dark glass obscuring her face. The legal aftermath was swift and devastating, made with high-definition video of her face inside the bait box, GPS tracking records, and the literal glowing evidence on her hands. Helen's defense attorney advised her to skip a trial. She signed a federal plea agreement pleading guilty to 2 counts of mail theft and 1 count of extortion. A federal judge sentenced her to 3 years of probation, a $25,000 fine, and 500 hours of community service, ironically spent cleaning trash along the county highways. Additionally, she was forced to sell her beige brick home to pay the legal fees and the restitution demanded by her victims. The Oakwood Estates HOA board held an emergency meeting that next Tuesday. In a unanimous vote, they dissolved the Aesthetic Harmony Committee, repealed Amendment 42, and abolished all active lawn monitoring regulations. The retired men with the digital calipers retreated to their garages, their calipers tucked away in drawers. On a warm evening in late October, Julian sat on his front porch, a cup of hot coffee steaming in his hand. The air was crisp, the smell of wood smoke drifting from a nearby chimney. The grass on his lawn was slightly longer than 2.5 inches, and he didn't care. His phone buzzed. He opened the video call app. Emily's face appeared on the screen, her background showing a beautiful cobblestone street in Munich under a clear European sky. "How is it over there?" Julian asked, a soft smile spreading across his face. "It's beautiful, Julian," she said, her voice bright and full of life. "No beige brick, no lawns to worry about. And I just signed the final paperwork for the lab space. How is the house?" Julian looked down his driveway, then toward the corner of the street, where the green utility wagon would never squeak again. "The house is quiet," Julian said, taking a sip of his coffee, "and the mail was delivered directly to our door today, on time, unopened."